Hello and welcome to this webinar. We are looking at the female characters in Inspector Calls, and this is for year 10 and 11. There are three key takeaways or learning aims that I'd like us to understand. First of all, I'd like us to understand the characterization, symbolism, context, and author's intentions for Eva Smith. I'd also like us to understand that for Sheila Burling and also for Mrs. Burling, Mrs. Sybil Burling. This is to help you with your GCSE and for those students who have centre assessed grades and teacher assessed grades. This is the understanding and knowledge that your teachers will want you to know in order to secure a grade 5 or above. The first thing we need to understand is that these characters are not real women. These female characters are constructs. That means they are creations, and they have been built and shaped and written by J.B. Priestley in order to explore key questions. There are two key questions that I think the female characters help us to consider. First of all, can individuals change, improve, and stop making the same mistakes? These three women are a type. Sybil Burling, Mrs. Burling, is from the aristocracy. This is old money, people who have had privilege and power for many centuries and generations. Can these individuals improve? Can they change? Can they stop making mistakes? Sheila Burling is the new woman. It's the defining moment, perhaps, in feminism, where women began to have the vote, began to have equal respect in society, or more equal respect in society. So can this individual, Sheila Burling, change, improve, and stop making mistakes? Can the new woman do that? And then Eva Smith, she represents the working class, the underclass even, people who don't have money or privilege or influence or power, people who do make mistakes and are exploited. So that can these individuals change, improve, and stop making the same mistakes? But together, as a collective, they're thinking about the whole of society. So through these three female characters, Priestley's really asking the question, can society change, improve, and stop making the same old mistakes? Let's look first at Mrs. Burling. So Mrs. Burling's name is symbolic. The name Sybil actually means prophetess, which is usually associated with seeing into the future and somehow doing God's work. This, however, creates irony because Sybil, as a character, lacks insight and lacks foresight, and she only realizes the truth about Eric too late. And we can see that from her prejudice and her greed and selfishness that she lacks Christian morals. So as a character, there are many words that we can use to describe Mrs. Burling, and this is some of the vocabulary that you can use to accurately pinpoint her. Judgmental. She's willing to stand above others. Prejudiced. She already has a set idea of what the working classes are like, and she's unwilling to change that notion. Aristocratic. She comes from privilege and money, and we're told that, in fact, her family was more wealthy and more influential than her husband's family. Controlling. She likes very much to be in charge. And hypocritical. She's happy for the father of the child to take all the blame, but once she realizes it's her own son, she's unwilling for him to suffer public torment. We also see Sybil Burling being used to embody attitudes and beliefs of that time. So for many women in 1912, and the same for when the play was written, they had sheltered lives, and they were sheltered from the reality of their own children. She didn't really understand what Eric was doing. She also was defensive for her own status and name and reputation, and that attitude of defensiveness is built on social hierarchy. She's a matriarch. That means she insists on being in control of her children. And we remember when we had the recount from Sheila about Millwards, Mrs. Burling was insistent about the type of dress that she felt that Sheila should wear. So you can see that matriarchal dominance. She's determined not to lose face and not to accept blame. And even after the inspector leaves, she blames the other members of her family rather than accepting any responsibility herself. And symbolically, this is a morality play. It looks at the ways of living that are good and ways of living that will lead to damage of the individual and of society. So essentially, we could say that the Burling family represents deadly sins, the 7 deadly sins. And for Mrs. Burling, Sybil, she represents the deadly sin of pride. What about her involvement with Eva Smith's death? Well, she refused to support Eva Smith at her moment of crisis. Despite being the head of a charitable committee, she refused to give charitable aid. So you can see that judgmental and hard-hearted attitude that Priestley is criticising. In addition to this, when the inspector told Sybil, Mrs. Burling, that Eva had died, she refused to recognise her involvement. She was unremorseful and she was unrepentant until Eric himself proved to be the father of the child. So again, Priestley is looking at the hypocritical attitude of the upper classes and the aristocracy who want to cling on to their status, their name and their reputation. Even her husband is shocked by her cold-heartedness. Linking it to context, we know that the play was set in 1912 but written in 1945. Now in 1912, there was no welfare for unmarried mothers. That meant that they had no money and no one to support them if they became pregnant and their partner was unwilling to support them. And there was obviously a stigma for pregnancies that were outside of marriage or outside of wedlock. Interestingly enough, in 1945, some of these barriers had been broken. Due to rationing of food and clothes, people of all classes were beginning to eat and dress in a similar way. And because of World War I, they were often fighting side by side, and class barriers were being removed. And therefore, Priestley is almost warning Mrs. Burling and her class that she cannot hang on to status, name and reputation forever because society was changing. So why was he really using her? What was the author's intentions for Mrs. Burling? She symbolises prejudice. Instantly, when Eva Smith says that she's Mrs. Burling, she is instantly appalled by her. And even though she was desperate because Eva was pregnant and single, she looked at her as a bad person. Sybil always also symbolises ignorance. In her own family, under her own nose, she doesn't realise that her son is used to drinking. He's an alcoholic. He's dependent on alcohol. And she quickly leaps to his defence without realising it's the opposite thing that she must do. And she obviously also, as we've said, symbolises a harsh and hypocritical side of society, where she is happy to criticise her family, but praises Gerald for his clever reasoning because he's able to make excuses and reasons that negate her need to be responsible. Okay, that's the older generation, the aristocracy. Let's think about Sheila. This is the new woman, if you like. Again, her name is symbolic. Sheila actually means blind, which again is ironic because she is the first to realise the importance and the significance of the inspector's visit. Right, so which words would we use to describe Sheila? What's her character vocabulary? Well, affluent. She's very wealthy. She has disposable income because she can go to Millwards and buy dresses. And she said to Gerald that she was there earlier that day for his benefit. She's vain, conceited and spoilt. So she thinks about herself and her looks, and she compares herself with other young women. However, she is repentant and remorseful when she confesses that she felt threatened by Eva Smith's beauty and the prettiness that Eva Smith had. She is regretful and wishes to change. And she's transformative. So if Mrs. Burling represents hypocrisy and ignorance and prejudice, Sheila Burling represents transformation and change. She's a transigent character who is willing to be flexible and develop, whereas her mother is an intransigent character who is stubborn and unwilling to change. And Sheila is empowered at the end. Instead of accepting the ring, she says, no, it's too soon. So she has the power to voice her own opinions and to have her own mind, even if it doesn't conform with the rest of her family. What kind of attitudes and beliefs does Priestley use Sheila to convey? Well, again, like her mother, she seems to be sheltered from the realities, not just the realities of the family, but the realities of society. She's never had to be hungry. She's never had to be lonely. She's never had to be afraid like Eva Smith has. However, she quickly develops this sense of collective responsibility, and she understands that everyone is to blame. She's the social conscience. She loses faith in her family, and she understands that a change needs to be brought about. And she's a catalyst for Priestley's socialist views and his desire for gender equality and class equality to be expressed and voiced in the play. Like the 7 deadly sins, as we've talked about, she seems to represent the deadly sins of wrath, which is rage. She has a short temper, which leads her to be very cruel and rash, and envy, and that's the motivation of getting Sheila sacked from her job. So when she asked the manager to fire Eva, when she was in a bad mood, she, however, is instantly shocked and compassionate when she recognizes the error of her ways, and she's genuinely guilty and regretful. However, her parents do not share the regret and guilt, and she becomes very distressed at their involvement. Let's link her to the social context. Well, at that time, in 1912, women were not allowed to vote, but the suffragette movement was fighting for women's rights, and eventually the full voting rights were given in 1928. So Sheila is the representation of the beginning of that new woman and that social and gender equality. And due to the absence of fighting on the front lines in World War II, women had opportunities to work that were previously reserved for men. So we can see that kind of fighting, independent spirit in Sheila. So how does the writer, the author, use her? He shows her childish vanity, and it's replaced by genuine remorse. It shows that she is a social consciousness that is being awakened, that society's conscience can be awakened, and we can become aware of our own responsibilities. And she is the judge. She has a new, compassionate and responsible perspective, and therefore she becomes vocally critical of her parents and Gerald. She symbolizes a beacon of hope for a fairer and more empathetic future society. Right, let's talk about Eva Smith finally as the final female character that we'll look at in this webinar. Eva actually means living one. And again, ironic because she's deceased. But it's also an allusion to the Bible and the character of Eve, the first woman, the enactor of the original sin, the first sin. So it highlights her role as a type. She is a symbol. She is more than just herself. She represents all women of that status, the microcosm of lower class women. And smith is actually taken from an occupation like a blacksmith. And again, it links Eva with the working classes. So if we think about the words that we want to use to describe her character vocabulary, we would say moralistic. She seems to be very strong-willed, and she goes to her boss to ask for a pay rise. She is outraged when she's sacked. We kind of can understand that. She stops taking money from Eric when she knows the money is stolen. She's moralistic. She has a strong mind and a strong will. She's also warm-hearted because she kind of embraces Gerald into her life, but she's very vulnerable, so she's exploited by several men. She's emblematic. That means she represents more than just herself. She's a type. So she's Eva Smith as a character, but she represents working class women, how they are fighting against all odds, and essentially they are exploited and degraded. And the same idea through this word allegorical. She is used to help teach morals. What kind of attitudes and beliefs can we learn through her? Well, we can see that she is about equal rights. She believes in her rights. She leads a strike, albeit unsuccessful, but she is standing up for equality. Her lively personality and good sense of humour make her very unpopular, so she's seen as a threat. She's grateful, so that sense of gratitude in the working classes as she cherishes that time with Gerald. And although she tries to take control with Eric, it makes her desperate, but she's determined not to break the law. So she's exploited professionally. She's exploited by Burling in the workplace. She's exploited because of Sheila being sacked because someone was jealous, but she's also exploited personally. She's exploited by Gerald, who uses her for a short affair. She's exploited by Eric, who assaults her and makes her pregnant and leaves her. She's professionally and personally exploited, and eventually this leads to her hopelessness. So she stands up to Burling. She apologizes to Eva, but she gives in to Gerald. She tries to defend herself, but essentially as a victim, we can see that she's lost her battle each time. Let's think about the context. Well, socialism and liberalism were actually spreading in 1912, but definitely 1945, the Labour Party, after the war, won a landslide victory. So we're looking at liberalism, they're looking at socialism. Can we defend the working classes? Can we defend women who are exploited personally and professionally? Can we exploit women who try and stand up for themselves but never win the fight? So the author is looking at Eva, like Eve, as a central character, an everyman kind of character that represents and symbolizes the working classes, victims of injustice, who are marginalized, they're abused, they're rejected, they're exploited by the ruling classes. She represents that journey from determination to despair, but also she represents the opportunity to change society with individual behavior. If Mr. Burling and Sheila and Mrs. Burling had treated Eva differently, society would be different. So she represents the opportunities that individual behavior can actually change society. So once again, we're back to this key idea. The female characters make us think, how can individuals change? Well, for Mrs. Burling, instead of being hypocritical and hard-hearted and prejudiced, she needed to be compassionate and fair. For Sheila, instead of being angry and jealous, she needed to be kind and patient. And for Eva, instead of giving up, she needs to have more courage and determination. So for individuals, can they change? It seems that J.B. Priestley is saying, yes, individuals can change, and therefore society can change. I hope that this webinar has helped you to understand the female characters in and in spectacles. Thank you for joining me, and see you next time.